Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Such gestures of orientation, where and when we are, seem trivial, yet they form the fragile coordinates by which human consciousness resists the vastness it cannot name. Tonight, we will examine those presences that dwell beyond orientation itself, the outer gods, those horrifying powers that cultists whisper about in secret, and scholars dismiss only at great psychic cost. This inquiry does not belong to theology or folklore alone, but to that uneasy borderland where literature becomes anthropology and imagination shades into revelation. According to archival correspondence, H.P. Lovecraft conceived of these entities not as deities in any devotional sense, but as metaphysical symbols of cosmic indifference, a mythology for the scientific age. Emerging amid the collapse of 19th century certainties and the dawn of relativistic physics, the outer gods were the logical heirs of a world that had outgrown both angels and demons. They inhabit not heaven or hell, but the space between atoms, the void beyond galaxies, and the fragile dreams of humankind. Their whispers echo through pulp magazines, occult grimoires, and modern digital mythologies alike. We must recognize that to study them is to invite contamination, for every act of naming brings us closer to what resists comprehension. This series will trace their origins, their symbolic nature, their literary manifestations, and their cultural afterlives, as though mapping the unchartable. Consider carefully. It is not simply horror we confront, but an intellectual abyss disguised as narrative. By listening, by knowing, we become participants in an ancient experiment whose outcome was never meant for human minds. In order to understand the birth of the outer gods, we must return to the early decades of the 20th century, a time when Western civilization stood uncertainly between the certainties of religion and the terrors of modern science. It was an era in which telescopes had revealed galaxies beyond reckoning. Freud had unmasked the human mind as a labyrinth of instinct, and the Great War had demonstrated the mechanical efficiency of annihilation. According to letters written between 1919 and 1936, H.P. Lovecraft's imagination was both nourished and poisoned by this atmosphere of spiritual erosion. He described a universe without center, without mercy, without God, and his fictions, from The Nameless City, 1921, to The Dreams in the Witch House, 1932, emerged as symbolic testaments to that discovery. It is not simply a matter of aesthetic preference, but of metaphysical necessity. Lovecraft required the invention of gods in order to deny them. The outer gods arose as blasphemous inversions of the divine, entities that mocked creation by existing without purpose. Consider this carefully. The birth of cosmic horror coincided with the death of certainty itself, and the stories that followed functioned as memorials to both. From this cultural graveyard, Lovecraft unearthed not monsters, but metaphors for mankind's insignificance. The philosophical undercurrents of this period shaped the very marrow of Lovecraft's mythology. He read Schopenhauer's pessimism, absorbed Nietzsche's declaration of divine death, and pondered Einstein's relativistic vision of a universe unmoored from human perspective. Each of these influences whispered the same revelation, that meaning is not discovered, but imposed, and that such imposition is always temporary. Lovecraft's genius lay in translating these abstractions into narrative, his pantheon of outer gods serving as personifications of a cosmos indifferent to interpretation. In Azathoth, written 1919, he speaks of the mad piping of demonic flutes at the center of ultimate chaos, an image that is not merely poetic, but philosophical. Here, the center of all being is not light, but noise, not order, but dissonance. We must recognize that this vision inverts centuries of theological and aesthetic assumption. It is not the divine logos that animates creation, but the senseless rhythm of entropy itself. The implication is devastating. If the universe has a God, that God is asleep, and its dreams are our reality. Historically, Lovecraft's articulation of the outer gods coincided with the decline of institutional religion and the rise of scientific determinism. The early 20th century saw the publication of works such as Bertrand Russell's Why I'm Not a Christian, 1927, and the popularization of astronomy that revealed humanity's microscopic place in the cosmos. Against this background, Lovecraft's fiction functioned as both symptom and critique. He was not advocating atheism, but dramatizing its consequences, the emotional vacuum that follows intellectual liberation. When his correspondents described the mythos as anti-human, Lovecraft agreed without hesitation. The outer gods, he suggested, are metaphors for the ultimate reality uncovered by science, infinite, indifferent, and inaccessible. They embody the paradox that knowledge expands awareness, but contracts significance. It is not morality they defy, but relevance itself. By clothing these ideas in the imagery of mythology, Lovecraft rendered abstraction palpable, allowing readers to feel the philosophical void rather than merely understand it. Yet, despite their metaphysical bleakness, the outer gods were not created from pure invention. Lovecraft drew from literary precedents that mirrored his own disillusionment. Poe's rational despair, Dunsany's dream worlds, and Machen's sacrilegious epiphanies. Each of these predecessors contributed to his understanding that horror need not arise from evil, but from disproportion. In Poe, he found the aesthetics of melancholy. In Dunsany, the structure of myth. In Machen, the sanctity of blasphemy. Out of these materials, Lovecraft constructed his own theology of chaos. The first drafts of The Call of Cthulhu, 1926, and The Dunwich Horror, 1928, demonstrate how he gradually elevated terror from the psychological to the cosmic. No longer was the monster a moral warning. It was an ontological revelation. It is not the sinner who suffers, but the thinker. This shift marks the true beginning of the outer gods as intellectual constructs rather than narrative antagonists, embodying the terror of comprehension itself. We must pause here to consider Lovecraft's peculiar method of invention. He did not reveal these entities directly. He implied them through scholarly fragments, ancient cults, and pseudonymous manuscripts. The Necronomicon, mentioned casually in letters as early as 1922, served as both mythic artifact and metafictional device, a mirror reflecting the author's own forbidden curiosity. By attributing the text to the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred, Lovecraft embedded self-aware commentary on the act of creation. The outer gods are not simply within the story, they are within the act of storytelling, born from the author's attempt to render the unrenderable. This recursive technique transforms the reader into participant, forcing one to inhabit the same epistemic anxiety as the characters. It is not the myth that corrupts, but the process of interpretation. Each name, Azathoth, Nyarlathotep, Yog-Sothoth, functions as a linguistic wound, proof that articulation can itself be an act of desecration. By situating his mythology in the context of pseudo-scholarship, Lovecraft blurred the boundaries between fiction and documentation. He cited imaginary books, referenced non-existent archaeologists, and corresponded with real readers who treated these inventions as genuine. This technique, known in literary theory as false authentication, granted his mythos an eerie realism that traditional horror lacked. Consider the effect: a fictional cosmology presented as recovered fact, a metaphysical system masquerading as empirical evidence. Through this method, Lovecraft anticipated postmodern narrative strategies decades before they became fashionable. It is not merely world building, it is reality erosion. The reader, seduced by the apparatus of research, becomes complicit in constructing the illusion. Thus, the outer gods exist not in outer space, but in the interstice between belief and disbelief, between text and perception. Their true power lies not in what they are, but in how they are known. Philosophically, Lovecraft's creation of the outer gods represents a profound cultural inflection point, the transformation of myth from revelation to reflection. Where ancient deities affirmed humanity's place within cosmic order, the outer gods expose humanity's irrelevance within cosmic disorder. Their myth is not consolation, but confrontation. We must recognize that this inversion mirrors broader modern anxieties, the replacement of sacred teleology with existential uncertainty, the collapse of hierarchy into chaos, the loss of meaning amid multiplicity. It is not coincidence that the rise of the mythos coincided with global upheaval, economic depression, technological acceleration, and the approach of yet another world war. Lovecraft's universe, in its indifference, reflects our own. To name these beings was to diagnose an age sick with knowledge, and yet, paradoxically, through that diagnosis, he offered a kind of secular transcendence. If the gods are mad, then sanity itself is a form of defiance. To situate the outer gods within a deeper tradition, we must look backward, not merely into literary history, but into the spiritual and philosophical architectures of antiquity. While H.P. Lovecraft conceived of these entities within the crucible of modern disillusionment, their conceptual scaffolding predates him by centuries, if not millennia. Consider carefully. The idea of incomprehensible cosmic forces operating beyond the veil of human understanding is not a 20th century innovation. It is, in fact, one of the oldest recurring themes in human myth. In ancient Mesopotamia, in the Gnostic scriptures of late antiquity, and in the grim cycles of Hindu cosmology, we find metaphysical systems that echo the logic, if not the imagery, of Lovecraft's outer gods. These predecessors remind us that the fear of the unknowable is as old as civilization itself. It is not simply the monstrous that haunts us. It is that which cannot be resolved, named, or assimilated. The most striking antecedent appears in Gnostic cosmology, particularly in the myth of the Demiurge, a blind, ignorant creator god who fashions the material world in error, believing himself divine. According to the Apocryphon of John, a 2nd century Gnostic text, the true God remains hidden, utterly beyond comprehension, while the false god, Yaldabaoth, rules over a world of suffering and illusion. This theological rupture between appearance and reality, between the God who speaks and the God who is, closely mirrors the central tension of Lovecraft's universe. Azathoth, the blind idiot god, embodies this inversion perfectly. He creates not out of wisdom, but out of mindless dream. The structure of the world is not rational or moral, but accidental. This is not simply a thematic resonance, it is a philosophical lineage. The Gnostics, like Lovecraft, diagnose the horror of a world whose creator is either malevolent or mad, or worse, entirely unaware. In Egyptian cosmology too, we find echoes, though more in structure than tone. The primordial chaos, Nu, precedes the gods and remains the formless abyss from which order temporarily arises. Nu is never destroyed, only displaced, lurking beneath the structure of creation like a latent threat. Lovecraft's outer gods inhabit a similar metaphysical position, anterior to the mythos' secondary beings, the great old ones, yet indifferent to the affairs of creation itself. In fact, one might argue that the outer gods represent a regression to cosmic pre-structure, to that which cannot be named without inviting collapse. In Indian cosmology, the endless cycles of creation and destruction governed by Kali, Shiva, or Kala, time, reinforce this idea that the universe is not a story, but a loop. Such traditions suggest that Lovecraft's horror is not innovation, but restoration, a return to the terror of the oldest stories we have forgotten we once told. One must also consider the influence of Western occultism, particularly the syncretic systems developed by Helena Blavatsky, Aleister Crowley, and their respective esoteric societies. Lovecraft famously disdained occultists, but his mythos shares surprising conceptual ground with theosophy and ceremonial magic. The notion of hidden masters, vast cosmic hierarchies, and interdimensional forces accessed through ritual aligns disturbingly well with the mechanics of the outer gods. In Crowley's Liber A.L. Vel Legis, 1904, the deity Nuit is described as the infinite expanse of space, impersonal and beyond morality. This mirrors Lovecraft's own formulations of Yog-Sothoth as the totality of time-space, existing everywhere and everywhen, yet utterly without care. That Lovecraft arrived at similar conclusions through fiction, not mysticism, suggests a kind of cultural convergence, that the desire to narrate cosmic dread transcends genre or discipline. It is not magic. It is myth repurposed as metaphysical allegory. Even the linguistic DNA of the outer gods hints at deeper roots. Lovecraft's names, Azathoth, Nyarlathotep, Shub-Niggurath, are not random assemblages, but phonetic constructions that evoke Near Eastern, Egyptian, and Semitic rhythms. Scholars such as S.T. Joshi have noted the deliberate strangeness of these names, designed to disrupt linguistic familiarity and imply otherworldly origin. Azathoth, for example, blends the syllabic structure of Azazel and Thoth, invoking a biblical demon and an Egyptian god of wisdom, an ironic pairing for a deity of mindless chaos. Shub-Niggurath, often described as the black goat of the woods with 1,000 young, carries echoes of fertility cults, Dionysian frenzy, and medieval demonology. It is not simply exoticism, it is semiotic contamination, using language to break meaning open. Here, we must recognize the linguistic strategy. Lovecraft renders the unnameable by using fragments of older tongues, stitching together a lexicon of dread from half-remembered cultural dreams. Philosophically, the outer gods serve as the culmination of a recurring anxiety in human thought, that truth, if it exists, may be not only inaccessible, but intentionally destructive. This idea is not unique to modern horror. We find it in the Eleusinian mysteries, which promised truth through ritual, but punished the uninitiated with madness. We find it in the Book of Job, where divine order reveals itself not as justice, but as unknowable will. We find it in Plato's cave, where the light of reality blinds before it illuminates. Lovecraft's contribution lies in removing the final comfort. There is no ultimate meaning waiting to be discovered, no secret that makes the suffering worthwhile. The outer gods represent a post-revelatory metaphysics. Even if you do see behind the veil, you will find only chaos. It is not simply that we are too small to understand, but that there is nothing to understand. This reveals something profound. The outer gods are not so much gods as they are metaphysical placeholders, symbols for the limits of reason, meaning, and perception. Their antecedents stretch across civilizations, religions, and philosophies, yet their function remains eerily consistent. They appear when order falters, when the structures that bind human understanding dissolve into noise. This is why they feel both ancient and modern, both mythic and postmodern. They are not X, not Y, but Z, not gods, not monsters, but symbols of unknowability itself. And perhaps that is the greatest horror, the realization that behind all our stories, our rituals, our philosophies, there may reside not a grand intelligence, but an absence, a void that dreams but does not think. As we leave behind these ancient echoes and cross-cultural specters, we must now examine the symbolic tools Lovecraft employed to encode this horror. His use of language, alien, fractured, and blasphemously suggestive, was no accident. It was a cipher, a ritual in itself. In the next section, we will turn to etymology and symbolic language, asking not just what these gods mean, but how they are named, and what those names do to the human mind that dares speak them aloud. If Lovecraft's outer gods remain fundamentally unknowable, then language becomes both the gateway and the trap. To speak of Azathoth, Yog-Sothoth, or Nyarlathotep is not to describe, but to invoke. It is here that Lovecraft's fiction intersects with a much older ritual function of names, the idea that to name a thing is to grant it form, to risk unleashing its presence. The etymology of the outer gods, while never explicitly explained by Lovecraft, functions as an intentional disruption of linguistic familiarity. These names do not originate from Latin or Greek roots, nor do they comfortably settle within any existing phonetic system. Instead, they operate in a kind of semiotic interstice, suggesting familiarity only to violate it. Consider this carefully. Lovecraft does not seek to make these names pronounceable. He seeks to make them felt, and what they evoke is not meaning, but alienation, sounds that reject sense, utterances that corrode comprehension. Azathoth, perhaps the most central of the outer gods, presents a particularly illuminating case. Scholars have proposed various speculative derivations. The prefix Aza may echo Azazel, a fallen angel in Jewish demonology, while Thoth calls to mind Thoth, the Egyptian god of knowledge and magic. If one accepts this synthesis, Azathoth becomes a paradox, an unholy union of divine wisdom and banishment, of knowing and chaos. But the genius of the noun lies not in any fixed meaning, but in its resistance to one. It vibrates with contradictory energies, embodying the central Lovecraftian tension between the urge to understand and the terror of succeeding. Azathoth is not a being. It is a linguistic rupture. It defies translation. It infects syntax. This is not poetic flourish, but philosophical strategy, language weaponized against itself. Yog-Sothoth, another of Lovecraft's more frequently named deities, similarly resists linguistic mapping. The repetition of the oth ending, found also in Azathoth and Shub-Niggurath, forms a kind of phonetic family, an invented linguistic tribe suggesting shared origin, yet never explained. Yog-Sothoth, described in the Dunwich Horror as the key and the gate, functions conceptually as both threshold and totality. The name itself, however, offers no such clarity. It moves awkwardly across the tongue, an uncomfortable assemblage of syllables that sounds vaguely Semitic or ancient Mesopotamian without ever settling into any specific source. This is not accidental. Lovecraft crafts names that feel almost real, but not quite. Semiotic phantoms designed to destabilize. The result is not revelation, but linguistic vertigo. It is not a password to understanding, but a symbol of the impossibility of ever crossing the threshold it marks. Nyarlathotep presents a curious counterpoint to the other outer gods. Unlike the mindless Azathoth or the amorphous Yog-Sothoth, Nyarlathotep possesses voice, personality, even sadistic purpose. His name, however, is no less alien. Longer, more intricate, and oddly lyrical, Nyarlathotep possesses a rhythm suggestive of ancient chants or Egyptian invocations, but it eludes clean derivation. Lovecraft first used the name in a 1920 prose poem of the same title, where the figure of Nyarlathotep appears as a dark prophet traveling through cities, sowing madness. There, and in later tells, he functions as the intermediary between the human and the outer gods, a psychopomp of disintegration. The name itself reflects this liminality. It invites utterance, but punishes interpretation. In this, it reverses the typical role of divine names in mythology, where Yahweh, Allah, or Brahman condense metaphysical truth. Nyarlathotep disperses it into endless contradiction. It is not revelation, it is infection. Lovecraft's linguistic strategies do not stop at proper names. Throughout his mythos, he deploys pseudo-languages, arcane glyphs, untranslatable symbols, alien phonemes that serve to signal the boundary between human knowledge and cosmic reality. In the Dunwich Horror, the Whateleys invoke Yog-Sothoth in phrases that combine English, Latin, and invented gibberish, creating a textual environment of linguistic decay. In the Call of Cthulhu, the cultists chant Funlui Magrunaf Cthulhu Relia Ugahnagol Vtagen has become an iconic example of constructed language designed to be felt rather than read. It is not language for communication. It is language as ritual. And it is here that we must recognize Lovecraft's brilliance. He has not merely created monsters, but summoned an entire semiotic system built to collapse meaning under its own weight. These utterances do not clarify. They contaminate. This reveals something profound about Lovecraft's worldview. He did not see language as a path to truth, but as a veil. His outer gods are not simply unspeakable. They are anti-linguistic. They exist in realms where human categories, life and death, space and time, subject and object, have no bearing. To name them is not to gain control, as in traditional magical systems, but to open oneself to dissolution. The names do not summon power. They erase the boundaries that keep the self intact. In this, Lovecraft stages a radical inversion of the classical belief in Logos, the idea, dating back to Heraclitus and echoed in Christian theology, that the word brings order. For Lovecraft, the word unravels order. The outer gods are not known through speech, but through the collapse of speech. Their language is entropy. We must pause here to consider the broader implications. In a world increasingly governed by systems of information, by text, code, symbol, Lovecraft's mythos warns of a kind of epistemic toxicity. The danger is not just in what we say, but in what we try to say. The outer gods represent the failure point of language, the moment at which symbol no longer stands in for reality, but overwrites it. Their names are not descriptions. They are vectors. They infect cognition. And in this sense, Lovecraft's horror is not just literary, it is philosophical, even prophetic. As modernity advanced toward abstraction, Lovecraft intuited the limit, a world where names no longer orient but disorient, where language becomes not a bridge to understanding, but a trapdoor into madness. As we conclude this examination of symbolic language, we find ourselves surrounded not by knowledge, but by its residues, syllables that echo through the corridors of meaning, summoning not clarity, but vertigo. The names of the outer gods resist, contaminate, and consume. They do not describe reality. They warp it. And in this, they point us toward Lovecraft's ultimate narrative strategy, to render horror not as event, but as epistemic collapse. In the next section, we will see how this strategy is extended through myth building and narrative authenticity, how Lovecraft constructs a world that feels more real than reality, precisely by mimicking the forms of scholarly discourse, archaeological record, and theological myth. For the most terrifying truths, it seems, are the ones that hide behind footnotes. To comprehend the unnerving effectiveness of Lovecraft's outer gods, we must examine not only the entities themselves, but the textual architecture that supports them. For while their names corrupt language, their existence is reinforced through a structure of narrative deceit that blurs the boundaries between fiction and academic record. Lovecraft did not simply invent gods, he curated a mythos. He crafted false histories, forged bibliographies, and embedded his creations within an imagined lineage of scholarship, folklore, and arcane study. This is the foundation of his myth building, an elaborate system of narrative authenticity designed to erode the reader's ability to distinguish invention from documentation. It is not simply storytelling, it is simulated discovery. And this technique, though rooted in literary tradition, functions more like a philosophical trap. To learn more is to fall deeper. To investigate is to transgress. The reader becomes not a passive observer, but a participant in heretical epistemology. One of Lovecraft's most powerful tools in this myth-building process was the creation of fictional grimoires, texts like the Necronomicon, the Penacodic manuscripts, and the Unersprechlichen Kulten. These books, although entirely invented, are cited with the precision and formality of genuine sources. The Necronomicon, perhaps the most infamous, is attributed to the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred, a name Lovecraft conceived as early as 1922. This book appears across multiple stories, often quoted in fragments, sometimes as a forbidden text held in elite libraries, sometimes as an object of obsession that drives characters to madness. What is essential here is not the content of the book, which Lovecraft never fully details, but its presence. It haunts the narratives. It implies a larger, hidden body of knowledge always just beyond reach. This technique, known in literary circles as pseudo-documentary framing, gives the stories an uncanny realism. The more absurd the claims, the more meticulously they are cited. Consider the use of dates, locations, and institutional references in The Dunwich Horror, 1928, where the Necronomicon is housed in the Miskatonic University Library, a fictional institution treated with the same gravity as Harvard or Yale. Or The Call of Cthulhu, 1926, which opens with a stack of seemingly dry academic papers, found among the papers of the late Francis Wayland Thurston of Boston. These details are not ornamental. They are mechanisms of believability. Lovecraft does not present horror as fantasy. He presents it as research. The narrator is often a reluctant scholar, a skeptical antiquarian, or a logical professional, someone trained in the methods of inquiry, and as they uncover pieces of the hidden cosmology, they mirror the reader's own descent. This structural mirroring implicates the audience in the pursuit of knowledge, and thus in its inevitable consequences. It is not the monster that devours the mind. It is the process of understanding. We must recognize that Lovecraft's approach draws from an older literary tradition, notably the Gothic and the antiquarian tale. Writers like M.R. James often presented their ghost stories as recovered manuscripts or academic papers. However, where James used this frame to invoke the supernatural within a Christian moral universe, Lovecraft employs it to unmoor reality altogether. His fictions lack closure, resolution, or moral balance. Instead, they spiral outward, suggesting vast systems behind the visible world, systems that are ancient, indifferent, and disturbingly plausible. His world is not imagined in the traditional sense. It is constructed brick by brick, text by text, name by name. Each story, each mention of an outer god or ancient cult contributes to a layered continuity that mimics the development of genuine religious or mythological systems. Myth here is not delivered, it is assembled. Philosophically, this method reflects Lovecraft's own rejection of anthropocentrism. By embedding his horrors within a scaffolding of scholarly form, he underscores the idea that human attempts to explain the universe are not only doomed to fail, but might actively summon the very forces they seek to understand. This epistemological inversion, the idea that knowledge does not illuminate but summons, places the outer gods within a deeply unsettling tradition. We might compare it to the cautionary motifs in Faustian literature or the Promethean myth, but again, Lovecraft's rendering is colder, bleaker, devoid of tragic nobility. His seekers are not punished for defying gods. They are punished for uncovering that gods are illusions, and behind them lies only the chaos of entities who do not care. To document is to deteriorate. To read is to risk dissolution. The collaborative nature of the mythos further amplifies this effect. Lovecraft actively encouraged other writers, Clark Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard, August Derleth, to borrow his entities, his locations, and even his fictional texts. The result was a shared narrative ecosystem in which references multiplied and echoed across different stories and authors. The Necronomicon, for example, appears not only in Lovecraft's own tales, but in those of his peers, creating the illusion of independent attestation. This technique mimics how real mythologies evolve, through repetition, reinterpretation, and cross-cultural contamination. In this sense, the outer gods function like true religious figures. They are never fully revealed, only ever described through the distorted lenses of their followers. They become more real through multiplication, and in the recursive labyrinth of references, footnotes, and intertextuality, the myth begins to operate like belief itself. This reveals something profound. The authenticity of Lovecraft's mythos is not derived from its internal coherence, but from its external texture. By presenting fragments, by withholding exposition, and by insisting on documentary formality, Lovecraft builds a world that feels discovered rather than invented. The horror is intensified not by spectacle, but by process. The reader follows clues, gathers fragments, and constructs understanding, only to discover that what they have assembled is a map of their own irrelevance. It is not simply that the world is vast, it is that the world is already written, and we are footnotes in someone else's scripture. The gods do not see us. They only echo when named. The terror evoked by the outer gods does not stem from their appearance. Indeed, they are rarely seen, but from the ideas they represent. They are not creatures of malice, nor are they adversaries in any traditional mythological sense. Rather, they are emblems of philosophical collapse, embodiments of cosmic insignificance, the inevitability of entropy, and the illusion of stable reality. What Lovecraft achieves through their invention is not simply fear, but ontological rupture. They force us to confront the possibility that existence is accidental, that consciousness is peripheral, and that the universe dreams without us. Consider carefully. It is not that the gods are cruel. It is that they aren't anything at all, and that is infinitely worse. In this framework, horror is no longer a matter of death or punishment. It is the sudden recognition that meaning, if it exists, is wholly detached from the human mind. The first and most pervasive concept in the mythology of the outer gods is insignificance. Unlike the anthropocentric worlds of classical mythology or Abrahamic religion, Lovecraft's cosmos offers no moral order, no divine attention, and no promise of redemption. In The Whisperer in Darkness, 1931, the narrator muses, "I could not help feeling that they were not evil things, but simply inscrutable." This sentiment is central. The gods are not evil, but indifferent, and in that indifference lies the true horror. The universe is vast, not in a poetic sense, but in a way that renders us irrelevant. The outer gods, such as Azathoth and Yog-Sothoth, are positioned not just as deities, but as structural principles, forces that exist beyond human scale, for whom humanity is neither sacred nor profane. They do not hate us. They do not notice us. It is not damnation we fear, but exclusion. This philosophical posture closely mirrors the existential crises articulated by modern thinkers such as Blaise Pascal, who wrote, "The eternal silence of these infinite spaces frightens me." Lovecraft intensifies that silence, transforming it into the blind, chaotic piping at the heart of Azathoth. In Azathoth, a short fragment written around 1919, Lovecraft describes a god who gnaws hungrily in inconceivable, unlighted chambers beyond time and space. Azathoth is not a ruler, but a vortex, a howling symbol of meaninglessness around which reality swirls. It is not malevolent, it is mindless. Thus, the philosophical implications are devastating. If the cosmos has a center, it is occupied not by wisdom, but by lunacy, not by design, but by accident. The human mind, conditioned to seek purpose, collapses in the presence of such indifference. It is not annihilation we fear. It is the realization that nothing has noticed whether we exist or not. Closely related to insignificance is the second core theme, entropy. The outer gods are not builders or sustainers. They are not creators in the biblical sense. Instead, they represent decay, collapse, and devolution. Shub-Niggurath, the black goat of the woods with 1,000 young, is often misread as a fertility goddess. But her fecundity is obscene, uncontrolled, excessive, a parody of life's abundance. She does not bestow life with intention. She spawns. Her offspring, often described as writhing, shapeless, or blasphemous, lack coherent form. This is creation without meaning. In a universe governed by the outer gods, life is not sacred, it is statistical. Entropy, the inevitable tendency toward disorder, becomes not just a scientific principle, but a theological one. In Lovecraft's mythos, decay is not the end of the story, it is the story, And the outer gods, far from halting that process, are its agents. We must pause here and ask, what does it mean for a cosmology to be entropic? Traditional religions seek permanence, immortality, divine truth, eternal souls. Lovecraft's universe denies all of these. In stories like The Shadow, Out of Time, 1936, the boundaries of identity, memory, and time itself dissolve. The protagonist becomes displaced in consciousness, his mind swapped with that of a being from an incomprehensibly ancient past. The result is not enlightenment, but exhaustion. The mind cannot endure endless flux. The revelation that time loops, erodes, and recycles leads not to spiritual transcendence, but to epistemic fatigue. The outer gods exist beyond time, but not as its masters. They are its detritus, its residue. Their names echo through decaying realities, and the more we learn about them, the more structure breaks down. It is not the future we reach, it is the fraying edges of existence itself. A third philosophical concept, woven into the mythology of the outer gods, is the notion of dream reality. This idea that the fabric of the universe is not real in the empirical sense, but is rather a projection, a hallucination, or a slumbering vision, recurs throughout Lovecraft's fiction. In The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, 1927, the protagonist, Randolph Carter, travels through vast dreamlands that appear more consistent, more permanent than waking reality. The final revelation, however, destabilizes this apparent solidity. The gods of Earth reside in Kadath because they dream of it. The dream, not the world, is primary. Azathoth, again, sits at the center of all being, lolling idiotically to the piping of a demonic flute. The cosmos is his dream, or, perhaps more accurately, the dream of his madness. The implication is horrifying. We may live not in a designed universe, but in the unconscious overflow of a mindless being. To awaken is not to escape the dream, it is to dissolve with it. This motif of dreaming is not escapist. It is not romantic. It is nihilistic. For if reality is a dream, and the dreamer is mad, then coherence is always a temporary illusion. Human logic, morality, even perception, all of it rests on unstable ground. We are not the authors of reality, nor are we its interpreters. We are its artifacts. In Through the Gates of the Silver Key, 1934, Carter glimpses a cosmic vista where self is merely one of countless masks worn by entities passing through dimensions. Reality shifts like mist. Identity fragments. Here, Lovecraft anticipates the anxieties of postmodernism decades before its formal emergence, that the self is constructed, that truth is layered, that coherence is a lie told by language. The outer gods, far from being creators of truth, are its dissolvers. They unmake as naturally as they exist. What emerges from these philosophical strands, insignificance, entropy, dream reality, is not merely horror, but a metaphysical warning. Lovecraft does not argue that we should fear death. He suggests we should fear the absence of meaning. The outer gods do not punish. They imply. They do not speak. They emanate. Their presence distorts cognition, time, space, and identity. And the more we understand them, the more we unravel ourselves. This is not an accident of storytelling. It is the thematic core. The horror is not what they do. It is what they represent. That there is no final structure, no grand design, only chaos at the beginning, chaos at the end, and, worst of all, chaos in between. Having examined the philosophical concepts underlying the mythos of the outer gods, we now turn to the central entities through which these concepts are embodied. It is important to begin by stating what these figures are not. They are not deities in the traditional mythological sense. They do not possess clear attributes, coherent motives, or moral alignments. Rather, they are narrative constructs that represent metaphysical conditions so alien to human cognition that personification becomes both necessary and dangerous. The outer gods are not characters. They are forces rendered as grotesque beings so that the mind might glimpse, however briefly, the abyss they signify. Azathoth, Yog-Sothoth, Nyarlathotep, and Shub-Niggurath each serve a specific function within Lovecraft's symbolic system. They do not form a pantheon. They form a cataclysm. Azathoth, often referred to as the blind idiot god, occupies the central void of Lovecraft's cosmology. He is not a creator in the theistic sense, but a nucleus of chaos, pulsing, dreaming, unaware. In The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, Azathoth is described as the monstrous nuclear chaos beyond angled space, surrounded by piping flutes that keep him dreaming and therefore keep reality intact. This god is pure entropy, mindless, unstructured, and seething with destructive potential. His blindness is not physical, it is metaphysical. He is not merely unaware of the cosmos, he is incapable of awareness. Thus, he embodies the concept of non-conscious origin, a universe not spoken into being, but dreamed into incoherence. To conceptualize Azathoth is to stand before the realization that existence might be not the product of intelligence, but of madness so absolute it can no longer recognize itself. Where Azathoth is chaos incarnate, Yog-Sothoth is structure without mercy. Frequently described as the gate, the key, and the guardian of the gate, Yog-Sothoth occupies a paradoxical position. He is both within and outside the known universe, a being who sees all of time simultaneously, existing in every moment and place at once. In the Dunwich Horror, 1928, he fathers monstrous offspring with a human woman, suggesting not only metaphysical vastness, but intimate intrusion. Unlike Azathoth, Yog-Sothoth is sometimes depicted as knowable, or at least approachable, through ritual. Yet this is precisely what makes him more dangerous. He represents the seductive illusion that total knowledge is accessible and survivable. The irony, of course, is that such knowledge does not illuminate. It annihilates. Yog-Sothoth is not enlightenment. He is the collapse of linearity, the destruction of cause and effect, the obliteration of sequence. He is omnipresence, rendered unbearable. The most narratively active of the outer gods is Nyarlathotep, the crawling chaos. Unlike his brethren, Nyarlathotep walks among humans, speaks their languages, and mimics their emotions. He is a liar, a manipulator, a herald of dissolution. In the prose poem Nyarlathotep, 1920, he appears as a mysterious figure, demonstrating strange technologies that disturb and ultimately unmake reality for those who witness them. In other stories, such as The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, he assumes countless forms, some divine, some monstrous, or deceptive. He is the mask of the outer gods, the interface between the incomprehensible and the human mind. He does not deliver messages. He is the message, sentient dissonance cloaked in language. His role suggests a unique form of horror, betrayal by communication. It is not silence we should fear, but false speech. Nyarlathotep is not simply a trickster. He is the principle of misrecognition, the realization that even when the cosmos speaks, it lies. Perhaps the most misinterpreted figure among the outer gods is Shub-Niggurath, often dubbed the black goat of the woods with 1,000 young. While this title implies fertility, it is not fertility in the sense of renewal or blessing. Shub-Niggurath's generative power is grotesque, overflowing, and purposeless. In scattered references, she's associated with bubbling, foaming life, amorphous, and uncontrolled. Her 1,000 young are not divine offspring, but biological abominations, multiplying, oozing, and directionless. She represents excess as horror, a parody of nature's cycles unbound by necessity. There's no balance, no harmony, only spawning. If Azathoth represents chaos and Yog-Sothoth represents knowledge, then Shub-Niggurath represents the terror of unchecked proliferation. Her generativity is not sacred, it is metastatic. The horror she introduces is not death, but indistinct life, always replicating, always warping. What unites these entities is not similarity of form or function, but thematic orientation. Each one expresses a different aspect of metaphysical terror. The origin without thought, Azathoth. The knowing without sequence, Yog-Sothoth. The voice that deceives, Nyarlathotep. And the life that drowns form, Shub-Niggurath. Together, they form a symbolic grammar of existential collapse. Importantly, Lovecraft never gives these beings a stable shape. Descriptions shift, details remain vague, and contradictions abound. This is intentional. To stabilize them in language would be to tame them, and Lovecraft refuses to offer that comfort. His gods are mutable because they must remain beyond containment. They are not allegories. They are fragments of a universe that defies wholeness. We must recognize, too, that these entities are not truly distinct. In letters, Lovecraft occasionally hinted that Yog-Sothoth and Azathoth might be different facets of the same principle, one blind, the other all-seeing. This suggests that the distinctions we impose on the outer gods may be projections of human need, our desire to classify, to name, to separate. But in truth, their boundaries may be illusory. This circularity reflects the broader philosophical framework of Lovecraft's cosmos. Boundaries collapse under scrutiny. Knowledge loops back into ignorance. Form dissolves into function. The outer gods, like entropy itself, cannot be contained by category. They are not this, not that, but always more and less. To encounter the outer gods is not to witness evil, but to experience epistemic collapse. Within Lovecraft's mythos, madness is not a symptom of weakness nor a moral failing. It is, rather, the logical consequence of perceiving a reality that resists containment by the human mind. These entities, Azathoth, Yog-Sothoth, Nyarlathotep, Shub-Niggurath, are not simply too large, too alien, or too powerful. They are conceptually corrosive. Their mere proximity dissolves the frameworks through which consciousness maintains coherence. Time, language, identity, these collapse under the weight of contact. The result is not terror, but disintegration. Consider carefully. In Lovecraft's universe, madness is not a descent into illusion. It is a fall into truth. This theme is articulated most explicitly in The Call of Cthulhu, 1926, where the narrator remarks, "The most merciful thing in the world is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents." That line, often quoted, encapsulates the central thesis of Lovecraftian horror. Sanity is not the baseline of human experience. It is a protective limitation. When that limit is breached, not by trauma, but by revelation, madness emerges not as affliction, but as clarity's byproduct. The cultists who worship the great old ones are not portrayed as deceived, but as those who have seen too much. that babbling is not falsehood, it is language shattered by insight. This inversion, madness as a form of insight rather than error, places Lovecraft's worldview in sharp contrast to Enlightenment ideals of reason and progress. The pursuit of knowledge does not free, it fractures. In The Dunwich Horror, 1928, the hybrid being Wilbur Whately serves as a grotesque embodiment of this theme. Born of a human mother and the cosmic entity Yog-Sothoth, Wilbur is not insane in the clinical sense. Rather, he is ontologically torn between two incompatible realities, one grounded in space-time, the other outside of it. His attempts to communicate with and unleash his father are not evil, but inevitable. Wilbur seeks integration with a cosmos that has already broken the boundaries of his form. In this story, madness is not confined to the mind. It is embodied. It becomes biological. Wilbur's rapid aging, his inhuman physiology, and his psychic abilities all point toward a deeper horror. That madness is not a deviation from nature, but its fulfillment under the wrong conditions. He is not a lunatic. He is a prophecy. Lovecraft frequently aligns madness with scholarly pursuit. Professors, antiquarians, linguists, and historians are common protagonists in his tales, not because they are heroic, but because they are vulnerable to revelation. In The Shadow, Out of Time, 1936, Nathaniel Peaslee, a professor of political economy, experiences a multi-year fugue state during which his consciousness is displaced across eons. When he returns to himself, the trauma is not from what he has done, but from what he has understood, the vastness of time, the interchangeability of identity, the hollowness of memory. His madness is not the result of a break in logic, but of logic itself unraveling under cosmic pressure. Lovecraft presents this not as melodrama, but as intellectual realism. The truth is simply too large. The mind, unprepared for such scale, collapses into incoherence, not because it is weak, but because it is sane. We must pause here to recognize a crucial distinction. Lovecraft does not equate madness with chaos. Rather, madness is the human experience of order unmasked. The horror lies not in disorder, but in the recognition that order was a comforting illusion. This is particularly evident in depictions of cults. The followers of the outer gods do not merely believe. They have seen, and their rituals, however barbaric or obscure, reflect a reality outside human reason. Auntie dreams in the Witch House, 1932. Walter Gilman is lured into a dream realm of non-Euclidean geometries and trans-dimensional entities. His final descent into madness is not caused by superstition, but by mathematically modeled contact with impossible space. Gilman's sanity fails not because he is a fool, but because he is correct. He believes the evidence of his senses, and that evidence betrays reality. Philosophically, this suggests that madness functions in Lovecraft's fiction not as pathology, but as metaphysical initiation. Those who go mad are not lost, they are unveiled. The analogy is religious. Madness replaces revelation. But unlike religious epiphany, which brings communion, Lovecraftian madness isolates. It is a private apocalypse. There is no community of the initiated, only scattered minds muttering incompatible truths. This reveals something profound, that in Lovecraft's cosmos, the divine is not inaccessible. It is simply incompatible. The brain, structured for survival, cannot metabolize that which exists outside evolution's bounds. To encounter the outer gods is not to encounter danger. It is to encounter a signal without a receiver. The resulting dissonance is madness, not as delusion, but as overload, and so Madness in Lovecraft is not an end, but a transformation. It is not the destruction of the self, but its reconfiguration into something that no longer maps onto human categories. This is why many of Lovecraft's madmen speak in riddles, draw strange symbols, or enact compulsive rituals. They are not malfunctioning, they are translating. The mind, when exposed to the outer gods, becomes a conduit, a medium through which the incomprehensible seeps into the world. The final terror is not that one might go mad. It is that madness is the only valid response. The sanest character in a Lovecraft story is often the one who kills himself upon discovering the truth. To speak of forbidden knowledge in Lovecraft's mythos is not to invoke mere superstition or taboo, but to enter into a dialogue with a philosophical abyss. In this universe, knowledge is not redemptive. It does not rescue the soul from darkness, nor does it elevate the seeker into divine communion. Instead, it unravels, it corrodes, it annihilates. The pursuit of truth, often framed as a noble endeavor in Western thought, from Socratic dialectic to Enlightenment rationalism, becomes under the shadow of the outer gods a pathway to ontological collapse. The more one learns, the less one remains. This is not ignorance as bliss. It is ignorance as structural necessity. Humanity, Lovecraft suggests, persists only so long as it remains unaware of the foundations upon which the universe rests. Those who glimpse those foundations, even briefly, return fractured, if they return at all. Nowhere is this more vividly embodied than in the figure of the Necronomicon, the infamous Al-Azif, written by the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred. Unlike most fictional tomes in horror literature, the Necronomicon is not merely a book of spells or arcane symbols. It is a metaphysical contagion. Its pages contain fragmented glimpses into cosmic history, mathematical impossibilities, and invocations that do not call power to the reader, but open the reader to power. Importantly, Lovecraft never provides a full excerpt from the text. He gives only fragments, quotations, and offhand references, always partial, always suggestive. This narrative withholding amplifies the terror. The book's contents are known only through the effects they produce. Scholars go mad, cultists kill, investigators vanish. The Necronomicon is not a tool. It is a vector, an object whose very presence destabilizes those who engage with it. This device echoes older literary and religious traditions in which the sacred text must be approached with caution. In the book of Exodus, Moses hides his face from God, lest he die from the vision. In Gnostic texts, secret teachings are hidden from the masses for fear they will be misused. Lovecraft inverts this tradition. The secret is not hidden because it is sacred, but because it is ruinous. The reader of the Necronomicon is not elevated, he is dismantled. This motif recurs in the case of Charles Dexter Ward, written 1927, published posthumously, where arcane knowledge is passed through generations of occult experimenters, culminating not in wisdom, but in disfigurement, possession, and psychic erasure. In The Whisperer in Darkness, even listening to voices from beyond corrupts the senses. Sound becomes signal. Signal becomes invasion. The epistemic structures we rely upon, text, voice, symbol, become unstable. Knowledge does not liberate. It infests. We must recognize the implications here. Lovecraft imagines a universe in which epistemology itself, our systems of knowing, is inadequate. The structures that organize our understanding of reality, logic, language, memory, are revealed to be provisional, even delusional. The human mind, under the pressure of true cosmic awareness, experiences not mere horror, but cognitive implosion. This differs radically from conventional horror, where the threat is physical or moral. In Lovecraft's stories, the threat is informational. The mind is not destroyed by violence or temptation, but by realization. This is perhaps most disturbingly rendered in Through the Gates of the Silver Key, 1934, where Randolph Carter's consciousness expands beyond the limits of the self. He becomes aware of countless parallel versions of himself across infinite realities. Far from empowering him, this knowledge fragments his identity. He ceases to be someone and becomes something. He does not die. He is reclassified. What emerges from this pattern is a distinctly modern form of horror, what some scholars have called epistemological horror. It is not fear of the dark, but fear that illumination itself is the enemy. It is not the unknown that terrifies, but the partially known, that dangerous midpoint where a glimpse of the real causes the symbolic order to collapse. Lovecraft achieves this effect through narrative structure as much as content. His stories often mimic the format of scientific reports, journal entries, or historical documents. The language is precise, the tone detached, but the deeper the narrator digs, the less stable the narrative becomes. This textual disintegration mirrors the mental collapse of the characters. The act of reading becomes a form of participation. The reader, like the protagonist, correlates fragments and suffers for it. The text becomes a mirror. The reader becomes the next subject. This reveals something profound. Forbidden knowledge in Lovecraft is not simply knowledge that should not be accessed. It is knowledge that cannot be integrated. The mind cannot hold it. The soul cannot endure it. Unlike religious or mythological texts, where forbidden knowledge often offers power at a price, think of Faust or Prometheus, Lovecraft offers no trade, no benefit. There is only loss. The cost is not your life. The cost is your schema. In The Haunter of the Dark, 1936, the protagonist discovers a church housing the shining trapezohedron, a mystical artifact that allows vision across space and time. What he sees is not wonder, but paralysis. He dies with the knowledge that his final vision was both accurate and lethal. The act of knowing killed him, not because it was a moral failing, but because it was ontologically incompatible with survival. Importantly, Lovecraft never defines the content of the forbidden knowledge in absolute terms. He does not tell us what Yog-Sothoth knows. He does not enumerate the truths of the Necronomicon. He offers only symptoms. This vagueness is not evasion. It is design. It allows the terror to operate at the edge of cognition, where language dissolves and implication festers. The unknown remains unknown, not because it is hidden, but because it cannot be rendered in stable symbols. This technique positions the reader not just as witness, but as co-conspirator. To read Lovecraft deeply is to participate in the same transgression as his characters. You seek knowledge, you interpret symbols, and the more coherent it becomes, the more you risk encountering the same collapse. The horror lies not in the text. It lies in what the text reveals about your desire to understand. In Lovecraft's vision, then, the most dangerous act is not murder, nor invocation, nor even contact with the gods. It is the act of correlation, of connecting dots that should remain scattered. Books are dangerous not because they contain lies, but because they point toward truths that destroy the mind that perceives them. Madness is not failure. It is the price of comprehension. This reconfiguration of knowledge as viral, corrosive, and inhuman is Lovecraft's most enduring philosophical legacy, and it continues to haunt the modern psyche, where information spreads faster than understanding, and the self drowns in its own awareness. The outer gods did not enter Lovecraft's mythology fully formed. Rather, they emerged slowly, first as suggestive fragments, then as symbolic presences, and finally as structural constants within a growing literary cosmos. Their earliest appearances are less invocations than shadows, linguistic disturbances within stories that never quite explain what they signify. This gradual introduction was not accidental. Lovecraft understood that to create terror, not rooted in form, but in scale, he needed to suggest more than he described. And so, before readers ever encountered Azathoth or Yog-Sothoth directly, they encountered the effects of these forces, dreams that rupture time, books that radiate corruption, whispers that dislocate the mind. The early tales thus serve not as definitions of the outer gods, but as invitations to imagine what must remain unimaginable. One of the first clear precursors to the outer gods appears in Lovecraft's prose poem Nyarlathotep, 1920, where the titular figure walks among men as both scientist and prophet, and where Nyarlathotep went, rest vanished, for the small hours were rent with the screams of nightmare. This version of Nyarlathotep is not yet a cosmic entity in the full sense, but the seeds are present. He embodies disruption, speaks in riddles, and reveals machinery that collapses perception. Importantly, he is active, a being who moves through cities, orchestrating disintegration. This stands in contrast to later depictions of the outer gods, who remain distant and ineffable. Nyarlathotep, from the beginning, functions as the emissary of chaos. He bridges the gap between myth and man, making horror intimate without diminishing its scope. Through him, Lovecraft first tests the idea of the cosmic walking in human form, an idea he would expand in stories like The Dreams in the Witch House and The Haunter of the Dark. Another formative moment comes in Azathoth, 1922, a fragment that contains only a few hundred words but establishes a conceptual fulcrum for the mythos. The protagonist is lured away from reason and into a realm where the pounding and piping of some chaotic presence beckons. The text breaks off before any resolution, but the damage is already done. The name Azathoth enters the mythos not with explanation, but with suggestion. He is described elsewhere, in The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, for example, as the monstrous nuclear chaos beyond angled space. These descriptions are deliberately vague. Azathoth is never encountered, never described in detail, never humanized. He becomes an absence shaped like a god, a center that annihilates the very idea of centers. This method of withholding is one of Lovecraft's most effective techniques. It allows the reader to imagine Azathoth not as a being, but as a philosophical sinkhole, where the concepts of intelligence, order, and identity collapse. Yog-Sothoth, another pillar of the outer gods, receives more structured development in the Dunwich Horror, 1928. Here, the entity is named as the father of Wilbur Whately, who grows at an unnatural rate and seeks to open gates between dimensions. Though Yog-Sothoth does not appear physically, his nature is hinted through fragments. Yog-Sothoth knows the gate. Yog-Sothoth is the gate. Yog-Sothoth is the key and guardian of the gate. These statements are not clarifying. They are ritualistic, paradoxical, recursive. They suggest not a being, but a function, a metaphysical role, rather than a personal identity. Yog-Sothoth is access, boundary, and totality all at once. By embedding this language in the mouths of cultists and inscribed in ancient tomes, Lovecraft reinforces the idea that understanding this entity is neither possible nor safe. The very effort to define Yog-Sothoth becomes an act of narrative disintegration, and in this way, the character contaminates the story structure itself. Intertextuality deepens the effect. Across his corpus, Lovecraft recycles terms, books, and references, creating the illusion of a cohesive, hidden reality. The Necronomicon is mentioned in the Dunwich Horror, the Call of Cthulhu, and the Dreams in the Witch House, among others, always partially, never fully revealed. Names like Yog-Sothoth and Azathoth echo across these texts, linked not by continuity, but by atmosphere. This repetition mimics the way real mythologies evolve, through fragments, through the oral accumulation of detail, through the accidental coherence of disparate stories. Lovecraft understood that to construct a believable cosmos, he needed to mislead the reader into believing it already existed. Thus, the outer gods begin to feel not like inventions, but like rediscoveries. They are not characters added to stories. They are the condition of those stories' possibility. Importantly, the evolution of these entities follows no strict theological system. There is no creation myth, no canonical hierarchy, no resolution. Lovecraft deliberately resists systematization. The outer gods remain partial, unstable, and contradictory. This refusal to codify mirrors their thematic function. They are the unstructured within structure, the unknowable within narrative. Their names reappear, but their meanings mutate. Yog-Sothoth is a being in the Dunwich Horror, a principle in Through the Gates of the Silver Key, and a time-space totality in various fragments. This fluidity ensures that terror remains intact. To define is to tame. Lovecraft never allows us that power. By the time we reach the late dream cycle stories, particularly the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, completed 1927, the outer gods have achieved a mythic gravity that transcends mere monstrosity. In this tale, Randolph Carter journeys through surreal realms in search of the gods of Earth. He never finds them. Instead, he encounters Nyarlathotep, now fully evolved into a terrifying trickster figure who mocks Carter's desires and denies him access to divinity. The outer gods are invoked at a distance. Azathoth broods at the center of chaos. Yog-Sothoth whispers at the edge of time, but never intervene directly. This distance is essential. It reminds us that the horror is not in their appearance, but in their indifference. Carter's failure is not heroic. It is structural. The cosmos does not answer. In these earliest appearances and intertextual echoes, we find the full architecture of Lovecraft's cosmology taking form, not through exposition, but through erosion. The outer gods are constructed in negative space, through broken texts, contradictory references, and suggestive rituals. They are defined not by what they are, but by what they do to the stories that dare to name them. The earliest iterations resist the neat coherence of myth. Instead, they enact a slow, relentless unmaking of the human frameworks that would contain them. And in this, they begin to achieve their final shape, not as characters within the mythos, but as the unwritten law beneath it. Among the most expansive and enigmatic of Lovecraft's works, the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath functions not only as an epic of dream travel, but also as a mythopoetic map of the outer gods' influence across psychological and metaphysical landscapes. written in 1926 but not published until after Lovecraft's death. The novella stands apart for its surreal tone and unusually heroic protagonist, Randolph Carter. Yet beneath its fantasy-inflected surface lies a carefully embedded philosophical critique of the human quest for meaning, a critique expressed most acutely through the role of Nyarlathotep and the distant implied presence of Azathoth, the ultimate symbol of unreason. This story is not an adventure, it is a dismantling. Randolph Carter, who appears in several of Lovecraft's stories, serves here as a surrogate for the dreaming self, an idealist, a seeker, a nostalgist. He ventures into the dreamlands in search of a marvelous city he has seen in his sleep but cannot find in waking life. The journey takes him through vast alien geographies, the basalt pillars of the west, the onyx ruins of the moon beasts, the courts of the Zoogs, and ultimately toward the unknowable center of all dream, Kadath. These places, while fantastical, are marked by a strange decay, suggesting that Carter's dream world is not an escapist fantasy, but a crumbling internal architecture. As he progresses, he learns not that the city is unreachable, but that it was never lost. It was his own dream of Boston, transfigured into cosmic scale. This revelation, that the thing longed for was always his, leads not to fulfillment, but to confrontation with the horrifying truth of what lies at the center of dreaming, Azathoth. Azathoth is never seen directly in the narrative, but his presence is felt in the gravitational logic of the journey. Carter is warned that to reach Kadath is to come too close to the court of the outer gods, where Azathoth blasphemes and bubbles at the center of all infinity. The final leg of Carter's journey thus becomes a death spiral toward ontological collapse. The message is stark. The pursuit of ultimate truth or divine beauty leads not to God, but to a blind, idiot God. And yet, Azathoth does not punish. He does not even notice. The horror here is not action, but absence. The center of all things is revealed to be an uncomprehending vortex, a dreamer whose dreams form reality, but who cannot wake, cannot reason, cannot care. Azathoth is the inverse of the Gnostic pleroma, or Christian logos. He is not the source of order. He is the anti-source, a void disguised as origin. Yet, it is Nyarlathotep who drives the narrative toward this fatal recognition. He appears in the final act as a mocking guide, revealing himself to be the architect of Carter's quest. Nyarlathotep's cruelty lies not in violence, but in knowledge. He knows the yearning in Carter's heart and uses it to bring him to the threshold of annihilation. As the emissary of the outer gods, Nyarlathotep is not merely a messenger. He is a psychological destabilizer. He speaks in riddles, withholds just enough, and ensures that the seeker arrives at truth too late to preserve his sanity. In one moment, he tells Carter, "You have dreamed too well, O wise archdreamer, and have drawn dream's belfries too close to the waking world." This line encapsulates the story's central tension. The closer one draws to cosmic understanding, the more fragile the self becomes. Nyarlathotep's manipulation in the dream quest is particularly insidious because it is cloaked in benevolence. He grants Carter audience with the gods. He guides him through final revelations, but all of it is in service to dissolution. In this, he exemplifies a recurring Lovecraftian trope, the destroyer disguised as a helper. This device appears again in the Haunter of the Dark and the Whisperer in Darkness, where agents of otherworldly power appear as mentors, only to lead the protagonist toward ruin. Nyarlathotep's function is not to mislead, but to overlead, to carry the seeker too far into knowledge that the mind cannot hold. And crucially, he does not gloat. His cruelty is procedural. He is an administrator of collapse, not a villain. This detachment mirrors the nature of the outer gods themselves, who do not hate, do not punish, but simply exist, and through that existence, ruin the minds that try to understand them. Thematically, the dream quest of unknown Kadath reconfigures the traditional heroic journey into an anti-quest. The protagonist seeks a goal, endures trials, gains knowledge, but the knowledge gained leads not to triumph, but to existential vertigo. The journey does not change the world. It changes only the seeker, and in doing so, dissolves him. This inversion aligns with Lovecraft's broader critique of Enlightenment ideals, the notion that the universe is knowable, that reason is a tool of mastery, that progress is possible. Carter's journey reveals a universe not ruled by law or divine justice, but by blind dreaming forces that do not and cannot care. He returns not transformed, but evacuated, brought back to the waking world, but with the knowledge that what he sought was always already unreachable in human terms. What makes this story critical to understanding the outer gods is its structural function within the mythos. It shows how these beings can dominate a narrative without appearing. Azathoth never speaks, never manifests, yet his presence defines the story's arc, haunts every threshold, and frames every revelation. Yog-Sothoth is mentioned, but not invoked. Nyarlathotep is seen, but never fully known. The horror comes not from encounter, but from implication. This is the essence of cosmic horror, not what is shown, but what is revealed to have always been true, hiding behind the illusion of reality. The story teaches us that the human mind, in all its yearning and brilliance, is a dream itself, a bubble within a deeper dream, sustained by ignorance and pierced by the names of gods who never needed to speak aloud. If the dream quest of unknown Kadath presents the outer gods through metaphysical dream journeys and indirect implication, the Dunwich Horror, 1928, offers their influence in a more terrestrial, almost folkloric context, yet no less disturbing for it. Set in the decaying hills of rural Massachusetts, this tale offers one of the most explicit, if still obliquely rendered, manifestations of an outer god, Yog-Sothoth, within the waking world. Here, Lovecraft does not discard the tropes of witchcraft, rural isolation, or ancestral blasphemy. Rather, he integrates them into a cosmic framework, suggesting that even the most seemingly local horror is entangled in a web of incomprehensible, interdimensional forces. The effect is not a grounding of the mythos, but a demonstration that the outer gods do not descend into our world. They are always already here, waiting for a door to open. The story centers on the Whately family of Dunwich, an inbred, reclusive clan whose youngest member, Wilbur Whately, matures with unnatural speed, enormous stature, and a disturbing precocity in ancient and forbidden knowledge. Wilbur's mother, Lavinia, is a deformed albino. His father, as it turns out, is Yog-Sothoth himself. This unholy union produces not one, but two offspring, Wilbur, who is visibly monstrous but partially human, and his twin brother, who remains invisible for most of the story and grows to enormous proportions, haunting the countryside as a bodiless, mindless force of devastation. Here, Lovecraft introduces Yog-Sothoth not as an entity that visits, but one that impregnates, invades, and distorts the fabric of heredity and form itself. The Whateleys are not villains in a moral sense. They are participants in a cosmological error. Yog-Sothoth is described in deeply abstract terms. The Necronomicon, cited within the story, claims, Yog-Sothoth knows the gate. Yog-Sothoth is the gate. Yog-Sothoth is the key and guardian of the gate. These recursive phrases suggest not physicality, but a metaphysical principle, a being that is simultaneously outside time and space, and yet accessible through ritual violation of natural law. In this sense, Wilbur's existence is not an accident. It is an experiment in embodiment, an effort to bring what cannot be contained into the vessel of flesh. The horror, then, is twofold: the degeneration of the body under cosmic influence, and the failure of space-time itself to reject that influence. Wilbur is not merely a hybrid. He is a failed filter, an insufficient frame for something that should never have passed through into matter. His ultimate failure and death are not heroic victories for humanity. They are narrative delays in the inevitable collapse. The story's true climax comes not with Wilbur, but with his unseen twin. Throughout the latter half of the tale, strange tremors and unnatural sounds disturb the countryside. Livestock vanish. Hills are leveled. Invisible forces crush trees and tear through homes. Eventually, through incantations and ritual intervention by scholars from Miskatonic University, the creature is revealed and partially restrained, but only just long enough to deliver its final utterance, a plaintive wail to its father, Yog-Sothoth, help me, save me, Father. No, no, don't call me, don't send me back. I am Yog-Sothoth's. This line is crucial, not for its sentimentality, but for its metaphysical implications. The creature is not merely a monster. It is a child of a principle, a being of knowledge that suffers from having touched too much reality. Its madness is not from ignorance, but from over-definition. It cannot survive in a world that demands borders. Lovecraft scholars have often debated whether the Dunwich Horror represents a compromise of Lovecraft's principles. Unlike many of his other tales, the story features a successful intervention by human authorities, professors and occult scholars who manage, through forbidden knowledge, to banish the cosmic threat. But this apparent victory is hollow. The professors do not destroy the entity, they return it. The horror is not ended, it is postponed. The ritual does not restore order, but merely closes a leak. More significantly, the story implies that such leaks are inevitable. Yog-Sothoth, being all of time and space, is always pressing against the membrane of reality. The Whateleys are not alone in their heresy. They are merely the latest in the lineage of vessels, cultists, and seekers whose knowledge became too coherent. The tale ends not with triumph, but with the lingering awareness that the membrane between realities is thin and getting thinner. Narratively, the Dunwich Horror is vital because it introduces the biological and genealogical contamination motif that recurs throughout the mythos. Unlike the metaphysical abstractions of Kadath, this story roots cosmic horror in the body, in breeding, in kinship, in bloodlines that do not obey Mendelian inheritance. This creates a horror that feels intimate even as it remains cosmic. The monstrous is not only outside, it is inherited. The figure of Wilbur Whateley echoes forward into later hybrid characters like Joseph Curwen in the case of Charles Dexter Ward, or the alien-possessed humans in The Shadow Out of Time. The horror of descent, of being descended from something not fully human, is one of Lovecraft's most enduring terrors. It implicates identity itself. It suggests that madness and monstrosity might not come from the outside, but from the past encoded in flesh, where the dream quest cast the outer gods as remote forces encountered through dreams and cosmic vistas. The Dunwich Horror shows their intrusion into the mundane world, into family, biology, and rural life. Yog-Sothoth, though never seen directly, becomes present through consequences, through distortion, mutation, and the violation of cause and effect. The ritual language, the invisibility of the twin, the incomprehensible speech of the hills, all point to the presence of an entity that is not merely beyond comprehension, but beyond rejection. In this story, horror is not a visitation, it is inheritance, and once it has entered the line of descent, it cannot be cleansed, it can only be delayed. While Lovecraft authored the foundations of the outer gods and their cosmic significance, the mythos did not remain his alone. After his death in 1937, a circle of writers, correspondents, admirers, and literary heirs took up the threads he had left unwoven. Chief among them was August Derleth, who became both the executor of Lovecraft's literary estate and the most active early interpreter of the mythos. But Derleth's interpretations, while preserving Lovecraft's terminology and style, fundamentally reoriented the philosophical foundation of the mythos. What had begun as an immoral, existential cosmology was gradually reshaped into a quasi-theological system of moral dualism. In this transformation, the outer gods did not vanish, but they were redefined, softened, and in some cases, named into submission. Derleth's primary contribution was the attempt to organize the chaotic pantheon of entities, outer gods, great old ones, and lesser beings, into a framework of elemental and moral alignment. He posited that certain beings, such as Cthulhu, Hastur, and Ithaqua, were elemental old ones, representing water, air, and wind respectively, while the elder gods, a new category largely of his invention, stood in opposition to them as protectors of cosmic order. In this system, the outer gods, including Azathoth and Yog-Sothoth, retained their central roles, but were now implicitly aligned with cosmic evil, pitted against forces of balance and good. This shift contradicted Lovecraft's original vision, where the horror lay not in malevolence, but in indifference, not in conflict, but in scale. Derleth reintroduced the very moral binary that Lovecraft had excised, a universe of battles between good and evil, rather than collapse into neutral entropy. In narrative terms, Derleth's influence meant that later stories, his own and those of other mythos writers, often featured the outer gods as antagonists in a more traditional sense. For instance, in The Lurker at the Threshold, 1945, co-credited to Lovecraft, but largely written by Derleth, Yog-Sothoth is invoked through ritual and ultimately defeated by the intervention of white magic. The entity retains its apocalyptic grandeur, but it now functions within a framework of containment and resistance. The story offers something alien to Lovecraft's own canon, the possibility of salvation. By recasting the outer gods as threats that can be held at bay, Derleth renders their horror more manageable, and, in so doing, makes them less cosmically terrifying. What had been philosophical despair becomes mythological warfare. Yet Derleth's reorganization was not universally accepted. Writers like Clark Ashton Smith and Robert E. Howard, both friends and correspondents of Lovecraft, treated the mythos with greater ambiguity. Smith, for instance, leaned more heavily into poetic fatalism and exotic decadence. His gods were less systematically arranged and more evocative of ancient alien pantheons, timeless, beautiful, and terrible. His stories, such as The Devotee of Evil and The Dark Eidolon, resonate with Lovecraftian dread, but preserve a sense of mystery that Derleth's diagrams attempted to dissolve. Howard, creator of Conan the Barbarian, introduced Lovecraftian elements into sword and sorcery contexts, preserving the idea of ancient, slumbering horrors while mixing them with heroic myth. In their hands, the outer gods remain symbols rather than tools, not pieces in a moral chess game, but dreamlike presences at the edge of comprehension. As the decades progressed, the mythos became increasingly collaborative and decentralized, resembling not a canon, but an archive. Writers like Brian Lumley, Ramsey Campbell, T.E.D. Klein, and Caitlin R. Kiernan each brought distinct philosophical and stylistic sensibilities to the cosmic horror tradition. Lumley's Titus Crow series turned the mythos into a kind of cosmic fantasy adventure, complete with time travel, interdimensional voyages, and alien technologies. Yog-Sothoth and other entities became interactable forces, still terrifying, but narratively accessible. Campbell's contributions, particularly in stories like The Inhabitant of the Lake, emphasized the psychological dimension, returning to themes of locality, memory, and insidious intrusion. Kiernan, perhaps the most philosophically faithful to Lovecraft's legacy, eschews the mythos proper in favor of subtle, fragmentary narratives where the presence of otherness is unspoken but overwhelming. This expansion of the mythos into broader cultural territories has also introduced genre mutations. The outer gods have appeared in science fiction, cyberpunk, post-apocalyptic fiction, and even weird romance, evolving as the culture that hosts them evolves. In the modern era, their presence can be felt in works ranging from the metaphysical dread of Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer to the existential despair in Ligotti's The Conspiracy Against the Human Race. These reinterpretations do not always name Azathoth or Yog-Sothoth directly, but the thematic architecture remains: the intrusion of the incomprehensible, the disintegration of self, the annihilation of human centrality. In this way, the outer gods have transcended even the boundaries of their invented names. They have become motifs, free-floating symbols of collapse that attach themselves to whatever form best suits the cultural moment. This reveals something profound. The more others have written about the outer gods, the less definable they have become. Each interpretation adds mass, but not clarity. The mythos expands through contradiction, accretion, and remixing. There is no correct version of Azathoth now, nor should there be. In this way, the collaborative expansion of the mythos unintentionally mirrors the very forces it seeks to represent. Like Yog-Sothoth, the mythos becomes a totality, a gate through which countless perspectives flow, merge, and conflict. The attempt to define these entities in stable terms replicates the same epistemic collapse their stories produce. It is not that we misunderstand the outer gods, it is that they are designed to be misunderstood. And so, the legacy of collaboration does not dilute the mythos, it ensures its survival, but in the form most appropriate to the horror it represents: shifting, unstable, fragmented. The outer gods, born of Lovecraft's private despair, now exist across countless voices, cultures, and media. They are not monsters, not metaphors, not gods. They are what remains when meaning dissolves and narrative continues. And in that unresolved continuity, they achieve what no singular author ever could. They become inevitable. The outer gods, conceived in fiction, have long since crossed the threshold into cultural folklore, where they now inhabit the same liminal space as ghosts, cryptids, and ancient deities once believed dead. This transmutation from narrative to reality, from authorial invention to participatory myth, has not occurred by accident. Rather, it reflects a broader human tendency to re-ritualize fear in secular form. In the postmodern world, where religious frameworks often fail to provide existential answers and science offers only mechanistic indifference, the outer gods offer a strange, dreadful kind of substitute. They appear in forums, image boards, and dream diaries. They are whispered about not as stories, but as possibilities. In this evolution, we witness a peculiar phenomenon, the fictional becoming folkloric, the invented becoming infectious, and in that infection, belief begins to curdle into something far less containable. Perhaps the most potent example of this folkloric drift is the enduring Necronomicon hoax. Though Lovecraft invented the Necronomicon as a fictional tome, complete with fabricated author, false publication dates, and invented citations, it has repeatedly been treated as real by occult enthusiasts, pranksters, and paranoid researchers. In the 1970s and 80s, multiple publishers released translations of the Necronomicon, some claiming to reconstruct Lovecraft's sources, others presenting it as a disguised grimoire encoded in fictional form. These volumes included rituals, sigils, and incantations, none of which were authored by Lovecraft, yet all of which claimed lineage from his invented text. This recursive myth-making created a feedback loop. Readers encountered the Necronomicon outside of Lovecraft's stories and began treating it as an authentic forbidden book. Ironically, the more obviously fabricated it was, the more compelling it became. The absurdity of its existence was framed as proof of its secrecy. This reveals something profound. Belief often thrives not in spite of incoherence, but because of it. Beyond texts, the outer gods have also emerged in urban legends and alleged paranormal sightings. Anonymous accounts online describe encounters with faceless shapes at the foot of the bed, whispers in tongues older than speech, and dreams in which something named Yog-Sothoth spoke from the corner of the sky. Most of these accounts follow no coherent narrative structure. They are fragmentary, dreamlike, and often conclude with vague references to lost time, mental disorientation, or subsequent hallucinations. What matters here is not the literal truth of such reports, but the way they emulate the epistemic disintegration central to Lovecraft's fiction. These are not encounters with monsters. They are collisions with perceptual instability. The reports themselves function as new iterations of the mythos, written not by authors, but by participants in a collective psychosis that does not need to be factual to feel real. A particularly notable phenomenon is the proliferation of Lovecraftian cult simulation games, ARGs, alternate reality games, and LARP, live-action roleplay, communities built around the idea of worshipping or invoking entities such as Azathoth or Nyarlathotep. These activities often adopt the language of genuine ritual, incorporating sigils, incantations, and arcane texts, sometimes sourced from fiction, other times invented by participants. While many of these communities operate tongue-in-cheek, a significant subset embraces a tone of sincere, philosophical exploration, treating the outer gods as metaphors for chaos, the unconscious, or entropy. In these cases, the boundaries between fiction, belief, and performative ritual blur. This reflects a postmodern spiritual condition, religion without gods, mythology without myth, initiation without transcendence. Lovecraft's creations become usable symbols, terrifying not because they're real, but because they represent the absence where meaning should be. We must also consider the emergence of the real Lovecraftian experience in digital subcultures, particularly through dream forums and psychonaut communities. Users report visions under DMT, psilocybin, or sensory deprivation that echo Lovecraft's imagery. Enormous, pulsing entities seen from a distance, fractal cities that seem older than geometry, voices or presences that communicate without language. Whether these visions are influenced by exposure to Lovecraft's work or arise independently is almost irrelevant. What matters is that his vocabulary, the outer gods, the dreamlands, the unspeakable, has become a framework through which people interpret extreme cognitive experiences. These reports are not homages, they are not fiction, they are attempts to describe a reality that breaks under description. That the language of the mythos now functions as a container for the uncontainable reveals the degree to which it has become not just a literary system, but a philosophical tool. This process mirrors older anthropological patterns. In pre-literate societies, myths were living structures, spoken, shared, reenacted. Their truth was not measured in facts, but in effects. They were true because they shaped behavior, because they survived, because they explained what could not otherwise be understood. Lovecraft, knowingly or not, tapped into this mechanism. By constructing the mythos through fragmented texts, conflicting accounts, and deliberately unstable symbols, he created a structure that mimics living myth. The outer gods, then, persist not because people believe in them literally, but because they have become effective metaphors for the structureless horror of modern life. They speak to something myth cannot articulate, and science dares not name. And so, the transformation of the outer gods from fictional constructs into urban legends, hoaxes, and real sightings is not a deviation from Lovecraft's vision. It is its fulfillment. The gods were never meant to be seen, only suspected. They were never meant to explain the universe, only to disrupt our ability to pretend we understood it. Their appearance in dreams, rituals, and online accounts is not evidence of their truth, but of their function. They operate now the way ancient demons once did, not as presences, but as interpretive events. And in a world saturated with information, overwhelmed by signal, and starved of meaning, this ambiguity is precisely what ensures their survival. The outer gods have proven uniquely adaptable to modern media, their symbolic mutability allowing them to thrive across visual, interactive, and auditory formats. While rooted in literature, these entities translate effectively into other cultural forms precisely because of what they lack: fixed attributes, coherent form, or reducible purpose. Their vagueness, their conceptual scale, becomes an advantage in film, video games, and music, spaces where mood, atmosphere, and symbolic ambiguity can be emphasized without the need for traditional exposition. More importantly, these adaptations do not merely replicate Lovecraft's horrors. They expand the mythos by reshaping it through the lens of contemporary anxieties, technological overload, ecological collapse, psychological fragmentation. Each adaptation becomes less a reinterpretation than a reverberation, an echo that shifts in tone but preserves the dread at its core. Cinema has offered some of the most visually striking reinterpretations of Lovecraftian themes, even when the outer gods themselves are never named. Films such as The Thing, 1982, Event Horizon, 1997, and The Void, 2016, engage directly with ideas of alien intelligence, spatial corruption, and bodily disintegration. In The Thing, the shape-shifting alien creature is not simply a monster, but a metaphor for unknowability. Its true form is never seen, only its horrific imitations. Like Nyarlathotep, it walks in masks. In Event Horizon, the void beyond the known universe is rendered as a kind of psychic hell, where the laws of nature collapse into dreamlike torment, a direct echo of Azathoth's domain. The Void, explicitly modeled on Lovecraftian myth, introduces cults, dimensional gateways, and ancient entities who exist beyond our understanding. Notably, in none of these films is the horror personal or moral. It is cosmic. It is not evil that confronts the viewer, but indifference magnified into madness. Video games, as interactive mediums, offer perhaps the most intimate form of engagement with the outer gods. Titles like Bloodborne, 2015, Call of Cthulhu, Dark Corners of the Earth, 2005, and The Sinking City, 2019, immerse players in worlds where reality is unstable and knowledge is poison. Bloodborne, in particular, exemplifies this structure. Its entire narrative arc mirrors the descent into madness through revelation. The player begins by hunting beasts, but eventually uncovers a hidden layer of truth. Ancient great ones, worshipped by scholars who have lost their humanity. The transformation of the game's world parallels the player's progression in understanding. Insight becomes a literal game mechanic. The more the player sees, the more terrifying the world becomes. This is not simply an adaptation of Lovecraft. It is an operationalization of his ideas. Knowledge does not grant power. It deforms. It disables. In Call of Cthulhu, Dark Corners of the Earth, the game's sanity mechanic directly channels Lovecraft's epistemic horror. Looking at certain symbols, reading ancient texts, or seeing the monstrous results in visual and auditory distortions, eventually driving the character to madness or death. Unlike traditional horror games, where monsters are threats to be defeated, here the threat is cognitive. The environment is filled with secrets, but every secret makes the world less stable. Even successful progression is a form of narrative erosion. The player is not rewarded for discovery, they are compromised by it. These interactive experiences mirror Lovecraft's recurring theme, that the greatest danger lies not in contact with the monstrous, but in the will to understand it. Music, too, has absorbed the outer gods into its sonic vocabulary. Genres like dark, ambient, black metal, and drone often use Lovecraftian motifs, both literally and atmospherically. Bands such as Portal, Sun-O, and Cryochamber produce compositions that abandon traditional structure in favor of dissonance, repetition, and sonic decay, hallmarks of entropy rendered audible. Lyrics, where present, often reference Nyarlathotep, Yog-Sothoth, or Shub-Niggurath, but these names function less as narrative nodes and more as tonal anchors. In black metal, the worship of chaos and the obliteration of self merge seamlessly with Lovecraft's theology of cosmic indifference. In ambient compositions, slow building layers of sound mimic the sense of something approaching but never arriving, an echo of how the outer gods are felt more often than seen. The cross-media persistence of the outer gods reveals a key trait. They are aesthetic functions as much as narrative figures. They represent moods, dissonances, anxieties, forms of rupture. Whether rendered as digital avatars, sonic distortions, or monstrous silhouettes, they function primarily as conceptual irritants, destabilizing the structures they inhabit. This explains their success in media, where traditional storytelling breaks down, experimental cinema, procedurally generated horror games, non-lyrical soundscapes. In such spaces, the very lack of resolution becomes a virtue. The outer gods do not demand to be seen. They demand to be felt as pressure, static, interference. They are not characters. They are the horror of information itself. We must recognize, finally, that the enduring appeal of the outer gods in these media is not nostalgia, nor even literary admiration. It is functionality. In an age defined by informational excess, fragmented identity, and the erasure of metaphysical certainty, the outer gods have become icons of the unbearable real. They encode the fear that behind all our signals, our stories, our science, there is nothing. Only chaos, dream, entropy. In this way, every adaptation, no matter how commercial or stylized, points back to Lovecraft's core thesis that the greatest horror is not death or monsters, but meaninglessness rendered real. That horror will not vanish. It will only take new forms. The outer gods have not remained confined to fiction or pop culture. Over the last half-century, they have been increasingly adopted, repurposed, reinterpreted, and re-ritualized within subcultural and academic contexts. They are not simply consumed by audiences. They are internalized by communities. Within the esoteric underground, in online forums, tabletop rituals, performance art, and critical theory alike, these entities have become symbols of post-human identity, ritualized collapse, and linguistic disruption. To appropriate the outer gods today is not to worship them, but to use them as lenses through which to confront the unbearable weight of modernity's failures. And yet, as these appropriations multiply, something of their original terror remains. They survive not in spite of reinterpretation, but through it, always mutating, never resolved. One of the most striking examples of subcultural appropriation lies within the chaos magic and postmodern occultist communities of the late 20th century. In these esoteric circles, often influenced by thinkers like Peter J. Carroll, Phil Hine, and Robert Anton Wilson, belief is treated as a tool rather than a conviction. Within such paradigms, invoking Yog-Sothoth or Nyarlathotep in a ritual is not seen as a literal summoning, but as a symbolic interaction with chaos, time, or the unconscious. Chaos magicians frequently integrate Lovecraftian entities into personal pantheons, viewing them as masks of larger forces. Azathoth as pure randomness, Yog-Sothoth as the collapse of linear temporality, Nyarlathotep as psychological fragmentation. These reinterpretations do not dilute the horror, they relocate it. The outer gods become ritual metaphors, summoned not to gain power, but to confront powerlessness. This reframing aligns perfectly with chaos magic's emphasis on personal mythology over external dogma. Parallel to these ritual appropriations, academic disciplines have begun to treat Lovecraft and the outer gods not merely as subjects of literary study, but as tools for philosophical and cultural analysis. In fields such as speculative realism, object-oriented ontology, OO, and post-structuralist theory, Lovecraft's entities are cited as exemplars of what philosopher Graham Harman calls withdrawn objects, things that exist beyond the reach of human access, whose essence can never be fully grasped. The outer gods serve as allegories for the unknowable in a world obsessed with mapping, controlling, and digitizing everything. In this context, Lovecraft is not read as a fantasist, but as a post-human philosopher, his gods functioning as models of ontological opacity. Azathoth, for instance, becomes an emblem of groundless causality, a blind process from which all systems emerge, but which itself defies explanation. Moreover, Lovecraft's work has found resonance in the growing field of weird studies, a transdisciplinary approach to culture that emphasizes anomaly, contradiction, and non-human agency. Thinkers like Eugene Thacker, In the Dust of This Planet, Mark Fisher, The Weird and the Eerie, and China Miéville have all drawn from the mythos to interrogate the boundaries between knowledge and the unknown. For Thacker, in particular, the horror of the outer gods illustrates the idea of the world without us, a universe that continues regardless of human interpretation, unthinkable and impersonal. These academics treat the outer gods not as characters, but as philosophical events. Their names become shorthand for intellectual vertigo, for the failures of epistemology, and for the realization that human cognition is itself a parochial system built atop a chaos it cannot contain. In digital subcultures, the appropriation of the outer gods often takes the form of meme culture, roleplay environments, and collaborative fiction archives. Platforms like Reddit's RR Liminal Space, SCP Foundation, or even horror-themed TikTok accounts regularly invoke the mythos, whether sincerely or ironically, as a way to gesture toward the unspeakable. The SCP Foundation, in particular, functions as a modern myth machine. Its collaborative entries often mimic Lovecraftian themes, featuring entities that break causality, corrupt perception, or exist across incompatible timelines. Some SCP entries even name the outer gods directly, framing them as Thaumiel-class anomalies or offshoots of primordial chaos. This convergence between the Lovecraftian and the participatory allows users not just to consume horror, but to co-create it. In doing so, they echo Lovecraft's own technique, blurring lines between fiction, pseudoscience, and academic authority to create a simulated realism in which the outer gods remain plausible. There is also a political subtext to many of these appropriations. In a time marked by ecological crisis, systemic collapse, and post-truth politics, the outer gods serve as emblems of power structures beyond comprehension or control. In zines, performance collectives, and digital art installations, entities like Nyarlathotep are invoked to represent misinformation, mass surveillance, or algorithmic manipulation. Forces that, like their fictional analogues, speak our language while undoing our sense of self. Azathoth becomes a metaphor for ecological catastrophe, a sleeping, indifferent force whose eventual awakening would be indistinguishable from annihilation. The horror is not in malice, but in mechanism. These are not gods to be feared. They are systems to be interpreted, yet interpretation leads to no final truth, only to further breakdowns of certainty. It is not simply mythology being appropriated, it is the vocabulary of collapse. What we observe in all of these examples, magical, academic, subcultural, is a shared recognition. The outer gods are plastic, but persistent, conceptually vague, yet emotionally precise. They resist fixed meaning, and this resistance is their meaning. In a world saturated with data, but starved for context, they represent the failure of all explanatory models. They are what happens when narrative, science, theology, and politics all converge on the same realization that we are surrounded by systems we cannot map, messages we cannot decode, forces we cannot localize. Their appropriation, therefore, is not ornamental. It is inevitable. Any culture that brushes against the limits of its own epistemology will, in some form, recreate the outer gods, whether in ritual, in metaphor, or in satire. They return not as themselves, but as signs of our own unraveling. The enduring power of the outer gods lies not in their imagery, nor even in their narrative utility, but in their philosophical infection. They are not just mythological artifacts, they are conceptual viruses that contaminate any framework attempting to contain them. Azathoth, Yog-Sothoth, Nyarlathotep, and Shub-Niggurath are not symbols of fear in the traditional sense. They are avatars of cognitive dissonance, ontological vertigo, and philosophical helplessness, conditions that persist long after the last page is turned, the screen goes dark, or the ritual ends. The horror they embody is not episodic. It is ambient. It does not come from outside. It erupts from within, once the comforting illusions of human centrality and epistemic stability begin to fail. In this way, the outer gods are not antagonists to be defeated. They are revelations to be survived. Psychologically, they represent what Carl Jung might have described as archetypes of the non-integratable. Unlike the shadow, the self, or the anima, all of which find resolution through individuation, the outer gods correspond to a presence that cannot be reconciled. They resist assimilation into the psyche. They are not facets of the self. They are outside the category of selfhood. Yog-Sothoth's omnitemporal existence, for instance, violates our linear construction of memory and agency. To contemplate a being who is all times at once is not merely an exercise in abstraction. It undermines the very scaffolding of identity. Similarly, Azathoth's position as the blind idiot god at the center of chaos removes any lost pretense of a rational or benevolent cosmos. These entities do not traumatize. They untether. This philosophical rupture finds resonance in modern existential thought. Consider the bleak continuity between Lovecraft's depiction of a meaningless, indifferent cosmos and the existentialist idea that existence precedes essence, that there is no intrinsic meaning, only the meanings we construct. Where Sartre sees this as a call to freedom, Lovecraft sees it as a confirmation of dread. The universe offers no validation. It simply is. And to peer into its structure, stripped of illusion, is not liberating. It is annihilating. This is not atheism in the militant sense. It is a kind of cosmic agnosticism so profound that even the question of belief becomes irrelevant. Azathoth is not the anti-God. Azathoth is what remains when the question of God is shown to be structurally absurd. The universe is not for us. It was never about us. The outer gods exist to remind us of that. In this sense, the outer gods are conceptually closer to black holes than to demons. They are not against humanity. They are irrelevant to it. But this irrelevance is precisely what destabilizes the mind. The human brain is evolved for pattern recognition, narrative coherence, and survival through meaning making. When it encounters that which exceeds or contradicts those patterns, it either collapses or invents myths. Lovecraft's horror, then, is not that the myths are wrong, but that there was never anything for them to describe. The terror is not that the world is a lie. It is that the world doesn't care whether it's lying or not. In an era defined by data excess, global crises, and algorithmic mediation, this model of horror feels increasingly prophetic. This has implications for how we experience anxiety and identity in the modern world. The creeping sensation that our lives are shaped by systems too complex to understand. Climate networks, global markets, artificial intelligences, mirrors the despair found in Lovecraft's fiction. These systems are not malevolent, but vast and structureless, behaving according to logics that do not require human input. They move like Azathoth, blind, indifferent, mechanistic. The fear that we do not control our destinies, not because someone else does, but because no one does, is the beating heart of modern nihilism. And it is here that the outer gods offer not comfort, but recognition. They do not explain the world. They reflect it through the lens of horror, yes, but also with a strange kind of honesty. Yet this honesty invites no conclusion. There is no final synthesis, no path to redemption. The philosophical weight of the outer gods lies in their resistance to closure. To think about them seriously is to enter a space without answers, where the very act of inquiry becomes suspect. They are metaphors for the failure of metaphor, gods of unknowability, symbols of the inadequacy of symbols. Even silence, which once implied reverence, now implies defeat. What can be said about beings who are not merely beyond language, but beyond the function of language itself? They are not mystery. They are anti-meaning. And so, they endure, not as fixed concepts, but as recurring ruptures in every system that seeks to stabilize reality. Whether in fiction, philosophy, subculture, or personal reflection, the outer gods return wherever the facade of certainty begins to crack. They do not answer questions. They reopen them. They are not stories. They are the structural limits of storytelling. And in this way, they are more than fictional deities. They are psychic horizons beyond which the self dissolves, and only the scream of thought remains, unvoiced, unending, unheeded.